this is a new kind of thing for us. We have, for 2 years, in this fabulous space, been doing a breakfast series. And this is the first time when we took the opportunity of having this fantastic panel together in New York at the same time to grab a room and gather them for a conversation that I'm really, really looking forward to. I'd like to say a few things about why we do this and why this is a particularly good conversation for us to be having at City College. The Colin Powell School is a relatively recent phenomenon. We founded it in May of 2013. It is designated as a school for civic and global leadership. It is part of historic City College. If you want to know how historic City College is, if you step outside of the University Club before you leave tonight and you look over the doorway to the left, chiseled into the face of the wall there, is the logo of the City College of New York. We are one of the founding institutions of this terrific space. We have been contributing to the growth and development of New York City since 1947. And one of the things we talk about a great deal, and it's relevant to tonight's conversation, we talk about the diversity of City College. And for years and years and years, we talked about diversity in terms of the access it gave people to education. And that's, to me, started to ring hollow some time ago. It rang hollow because good people from across the country can find an education in a lot of places. Where our diversity matters, and it will continue to matter as things go forward, is that voices are represented in our classroom in the same proportion that they're represented in our globalized world. If you walk into a City College classroom, the perspectives and experiences and the exchanges that happen among our students and between our students and our faculty are like exchanges that happen no place else in the world. And I was thinking about that as we were coming down to the University Club today, because that's precisely the theme of today's conversation. We have listened to commentators in the United States really for the last 2 decades talk about rebellion and radicalization. And part of that conversation has been the interpolation of what motivates people to join radical movements. And for decades, the conversation has primarily been about what motivates men. But over the last several years, a second conversation has emerged about what it is that moves women to join radical movements, and particularly in reference to groups like ISIS, what moves women to join movements that, at least on their face, seem to be anti-women. And you'll hear today, explicitly from some of our speakers, by implication from other of our speakers, that our conversations about those motivations have been deeply dissatisfying because they never actually focus on the motivations of the women in question. And so today's conversation is really about recentering that conversation, recentering that dialogue on the lives and experiences and social and political structures that women around the world live in, and particularly in areas that have been sites of radical movements. We have a terrific panel. It is not my responsibility, sadly, to introduce them to you, but it is my responsibility and great pleasure to introduce today's moderator to you. ZANIB HUSSAIN ALVI is a data scientist. She's currently working, you'll see in her bio, she's currently working on a project called the Copenhagen Consensus, which is, it's about the relationship between energy policy and human development. She also is a member of DataKind, which, as you'll see, is a group of data scientists who are dedicated to examining the relationship between data and information and humanity. She has taken an early interest in thinking about how we at City College teach our students data, and this is a conversation that I'm really looking forward to carrying on with her. And as we were talking earlier before, she is in the process of taking programs that she has written over the last several years and cleaning them up so that they can be open sourced and available to everything. So information and data is something that's been important in ZANIB's life, and we're thrilled that she's agreed to join us today and to serve as moderator for today's event. So without further ado, please welcome ZANIB to the podium.
Hi, thank you for having me. I guess a lot of you are probably wondering right now how a data scientist ends up moderating a panel like this, and it's because I ask lots of questions. And I think moderator is kind of a lofty term or title. I'd like to think of myself more as your conversational Sherpa. Just want to help guide the discussion, make sure we're all on the same page, no one gets lost. We have a really incredible panel here today, and I'm just honored to share a table with them. I'd like to start by introducing them in the order that they'll be speaking, and start with NIMMI GOWRINATHAN. I'm very nervous about butchering everyone's names, by the way. I tried to rehearse all of them before, but it's one of those things where as soon as you open your mouth, it just sort of like comes out butchered. But I got it. Okay. Even amongst a gathering of South Asians, I think we have a lot of name diversity as well. I've been working with NIMMI on something called The Last Girl. We haven't decided if it's an institute or a collective yet. It's still in the very nascent stages. But I was so taken with the way that she destroyed some of my views on data, which was really interesting. Just we had a really great conversation about what's missing from the data that we use from day to day to understand the problems affecting society. And so that's sort of how we met. NIMMI is a professor, and in addition to that, is one of the most remarkable women I know at straddling these sort of academic, political, media realms. She's also the executive producer of a documentary series with Vice News, and has been not just an academic, but a really powerful advocate and activist. Next we have, you're sitting right here, why am I looking at the program? Suchitra, Vijayan, and... You got my name right. Okay, all right. Little round of applause for me. And one thing that you won't find in this program is that Suchitra has an incredible Tumblr, and you should all go find it and follow it. But in addition to that, she is an attorney and has been working at Yale on a project called Borderlands, and also covers a lot of fascinating different subjects, theories of war and violence, and just as overall an academic powerhouse. And our last panelist is Rafia Zakaria, and she is an activist and author and also an attorney. And she recently wrote a book which is sort of a combination of history, memoir, and analysis, and it's called The Upstairs Wife, An Intimate History of Pakistan. It came out in February, I believe, and sort of clearing the slate on... And everyone should buy it, and I'm going to be reading it this week, and I'm very excited. As a Pakistani American, it's nice to see this sort of coverage and in-depth analysis. It's just, her writing is absolutely beautiful and incredible. I'm familiar with her work more through her publications, like Dissent magazine. She has a really beautiful article that was published recently there as well, covering militancy in regards to women and what attracts them to ISIS. So we have a really incredible group of women collected here today. I think we're going to get started with NIMMI's presentation, and she will be sort of setting the tone for the evening and diving into the sort of main subject matter of female fighters and why we have such a hard time identifying and understanding them. Thank you.
I'd like to start by just really thanking the Colin Powell Center. One of the reasons I'm really happy to be there is that they take seriously this idea of engaged scholarship. I think at other institutions you have one scholar who's an engaged scholar, and at Colin Powell you have every scholar is an engaged scholar. So I'm really grateful to be there, to them for hosting this. This panel was born out of the frustration of women, and I think that's really important, to recognize that this idea, this moment, this sort of reclaiming of space came out of myself, Suchitra, Rafia being really frustrated with these perceptions of female fighters, and they're from the countries that we are from, right? This idea that they were sensationalized, in some cases they were fetishized, right? And we had very little control over it because the mainstream media was in charge of it. And this, obviously is not something that's going to be broadcast on CNN, but it is a way for us to reclaim that space as something of what I call myself, which is an inside-outsider, a Sri Lankan Tamil American who has lived and worked in Sri Lanka, who grew up as a Tamil Sri Lankan in a very intense community, has thought about Sri Lanka from every possible perspective. So Sri Lanka, for those of you who don't know, about 5 years ago came out of a civil war that was between the Tamil Tiger separatists and the majority Sinhalese government. I was there sort of at various stages of the war over the past 15 years as an activist, as a volunteerist, as an academic, as a policy worker, as a human rights researcher, as a writer. I tried every possible way to get at the Tamil woman and her struggles. And they have really informed my thinking today, those 15 years with those women. So one of the things that I want to start with is what our assumptions are about women. The first is that they're more peaceful than men. Now, people are very careful now not to say that out loud, but it's still there. It's still underlying this moral outrage we feel when we look at the women of ISIS, right? You still want to believe that women are more peaceful. The second is that when women join a rebel movement, they're necessarily pawns of a man's patriarchal project. They're cannon fodder. These are words that have been used before, right? Which in itself denies them any agency or any sort of politics to themselves. And it's not as if this is a new phenomenon, the women of ISIS. Women have been 30% of movements in Eritrea, in Nepal, in El Salvador, in Sri Lanka for decades and decades now. And one of the things when you struggle with people talking about women in violence and they have a hard time understanding it, one of the things I always go back to is, well, let's look at these women that you think are so peaceful. Let's give them the respect of seeing their politics, the real politics. If you take someone like Aung San Suu Kyi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her activism, and is seen as this ideal of the peaceful woman, right? What about her politics? What about the violence within her politics? The fact that she is sort of implicitly allowing the violence against a minority community in her own country. So even if you don't want to see women as violent, let's look at the peaceful women. Let's see what their politics are. One of the really good theories, I think, on women who join movements is this question of pushed and pulled, that they're pushed into movements and they're pulled into movements. Particularly when you look at what's happened with ISIS, our focus is on what pulls them, right? We look at the recruitment methods of the groups. We look at social media. This is my favorite of the recent phenomenons is social media. Social media is not a social movement. Social media does not have an ask. A social movement has an ask. Generally, they're asking you to sacrifice your life for a political message, not add a hashtag to something. This is not a way we should be understanding female fighters. And there's this assumption that these women are sort of untethered, they're apolitical, they're existing in this blank space, just open to be pulled by any movement that decides to talk to them, right? And this is the assumption that we have about female fighters. All the stuff coming out about women joining ISIS, all these unauthorized sort of mini memoirs that focus on her Twitter feed and the fact that she liked Harry Potter or she liked Coldplay. And that's how we're going to understand the entirety of her identity, through Harry Potter and Coldplay. If you look at the difference between the Bangladeshi girls in the UK and the white woman in Colorado who joined the Islamic State, right? The Bangladeshi girls in the UK are a completely different case. Whether or not they liked Harry Potter or Coldplay, they come from a legacy of violence. They come from a space where they were raised by a generation that left the political violence of the West. That's not going to not affect them. It didn't not affect me. It's not going to not affect them. And we assume that social media sort of works in this one way. You think all the information they're getting is about ISIS, but they are also hearing about the millions of Syrian women who are middle-class women who have now been forced into prostitution. They are also reading about the beheadings of women in Saudi Arabia every day, right? And it pulls on these identity threads in a unique way. And we have to be able to see that, right? They're going to read that information, hear it differently. The FBI has dismissed terrorists as these wound collectors. And I find it a very problematic term because when you're talking about women, these wounds are very, very deep. And they're in very intimate spaces, and it's very hard to ignore that those wounds exist. So what is pushing them? What is pushing women towards these movements, right? How do we understand not just what's pulling them, but what is pushing them? And to me, I focus a lot on misogyny and militancy, and particularly the case of Sri Lanka. In the recent news, you've had all these moments of extremism, right? The woman blows herself up. She's at the Paris supermarket and she shoots everybody. And we wait for this moment of extremism, and then we go backwards, looking for motivation and meaning in her actions, right? But we wait till that moment. We didn't ask the questions in time. What was driving her? You have all of these women, Suchitra al-Rashawi in Jordan, you have Hayat in Paris, and the only thing we know how to do is to read her politics through the men around her. That this was her boyfriend who wanted to do this, or that her brothers had been killed by American militancy. I mean, Suchitra al-Rashawi in Jordan got married 2 days before she tried to set off a suicide bomb in a hotel. It's very likely that the man was her vehicle to political agency rather than the other way around, right? So there's been a lot of focus on suicide bombers. I mean, I've met a lot of suicide bombers in Sri Lanka, a lot of would-be suicide bombers. And I always find it a very strange focus. Yes, it's very shocking. She blows herself up, and it disturbs us. But everybody I met, every woman I met entering the Tigers said, this is how I chose to die. Not this is how I chose to live. This is how I chose to die. So your real problem is, why are there so many women in the world who are suicidal? Not the suicide bomber, that's just how she dies. And to me, I focus on sort of the daily life of these women. What made her suicidal? This life of militarization, of displacement, of gender-based violence, all these things that we look at and we say, well, it's going to make women sad, and it's going to make them, socioeconomically deprived, and it's going to make them disadvantaged, but we don't look at them and say that there's going to be a political impact. All of these things, militarization, refugee camps, gender-based violence, these are political acts, so they necessarily will have a political impact. But we don't want to see what the political impact is. My work is actually on forced recruits. It's on women who were forced to join the LTT. And it was sort of an interesting moment because I went in to find out why they wanted to join the movement, and everybody was like, well, I was abducted. And you can't write a PhD about that one sentence. So I started looking deeper into it, and what I found was that we were focusing too much on that moment of recruitment, because you had all these women who were abducted into the Tigers who ended up becoming high-ranking cadre, who ended up being the most committed to the movement. How is that possible? I mean, we would assume that once they had a chance, they would leave, but they didn't. And this is where the life histories come in. This is why I work on coercive recruitment, because over the course of their lives, they had these experiences that shaped their politics. Militarization is a big one. Everybody looks at militarization as just, it's a part of war. And we talk about it now in the context of the police, which is great to hear it finally being talked about in the US, because that's what it is, it's militarization, right? What militarization actually is the deepest intrusion of the state into the intimate spaces of a community, right? With violence. And who occupies those spaces in the developing world? It's women who occupy those spaces. So if everything about her life is determined by the military, where she goes to the bathroom, how she gets food, how her daughter walks to school, that is necessarily going to shape who she is as a person politically. It will change her politics. Displacement. You don't actually need a woman to have seen her husband's head blown off to go crazy to join a movement. Just sitting in a refugee camp, if you haven't been in a refugee camp, they're like the saddest places on earth, and sitting in the dust for hours and hours, and sitting in the heat and waiting in line for rations and leaving your babies behind to have babies, that's going to change the way you think about the context of your life, right? Rape, again, the women that I met in the churches when I was sort of hiding out doing this research, the first thing that they would say is, I can't go back because my father doesn't know I was raped. So she's outside the family. And I can't go back because I was an ex-soldier, so the government will look for me in the village. So she's outside the village. She can't go to weddings or anything happy in the community, so she's outside the community. And she's living in this space of extreme marginalization. And if you want to worry about an extreme, worry about this extreme. How you deal with extreme marginalization. Sexual torture. This is something the US Senate report came out with. This wonderful report on all the things that the US did wrong, except that there was not one woman mentioned in it. And perhaps the US has never tortured a woman. Who am I to say? But There's enough evidence that they supported plenty of countries, like Jordan, like Sri Lanka, like Libya, who did regularly sexually torture women. You don't come out of that having the same politics that you did before. It never will change that. And on the other side, internal to the community, it's not, they didn't see a difference. The state was oppressing them. And then, yes, the misogyny in our community was also pushing them in that direction. This was a chance to be equal with men. This was a chance not to have an early marriage. All of these things work together. There's not one or the other sort of reason for these women. And the real struggle is you have these women who have been dispossessed personally, politically, marginalized. And how do we draw them back in? We draw them back into the mainstream of society with this language of equality and empowerment. That's what we do. I mean, I refer to it as the chickens and cows argument, which is sort of glib, but it is what we do. We throw chickens and cows at women around the world. We throw sewing machines at them, and we expect that that's going to bring them from all the way out here back to the mainstream of society. And this is something I have loved Rafia's work on, this idea of feminist equality, this myth of Western feminism. Even with ISIS, we've created the good female fighter and the bad female fighter. We have the Kurdish women who are good, and we have the bad ones who are in ISIS. Again, applying a feminist lens to them, right? There are these articles in the New York Times that women in the Kurdistan are fighting sexism and ISIS. No, they're fighting for Kurdistan. That is what they have always been fighting for. They are not fighting for women's rights. That is not their primary source of tension, right? You're not going to die because you're a woman. It sucks in a lot of these countries, but you will die from being a Tamil. You will die from being a Sunni. You will die from being any number of things, and you are going to fight along that fault line. Right? You're not necessarily going to fight for women's rights. And that's sort of where, I struggle with this idea. People look at the Tigers and they're like, well, they were anti-feminist. I don't know. A lot of the women that I spoke to, that wasn't their fight. That wasn't their concern. They never had any interest in this idea of feminism. And yes, there is this moment, I think, of battlefield liberation that most women feel, and they feel empowered, and whatever that word means. But that isn't necessarily addressing sort of engendering this movement, right? It's not that they're not aware that there's patriarchy. They're well aware that within the movement there is patriarchy, but ISIS is not the first movement where women joined a movement that was repressive to women. Almost all of these movements were repressive to women. And it was something that you couldn't get away from, because if you talk about building a Tamil nation, what is that nation? Who belongs and who doesn't belong? The movement had to create an idea, an identity, based on cultural values, based on identity. And gender roles were central to that. They couldn't go in and be seen as challenging gender roles. So you had women in boots and the Tigers walking around telling women on bicycles they had to wear longer skirts, telling them they had to wear their hair braided, while they're walking around in fatigues, and they would say, well, if we're not fighting for Tamil values, then what else are we fighting for? So these are sort of the complications that we have in the female fighter and that we struggle with. And this is, the work I'm doing now is this question of empowerment. And I've just come from Mexico City, and a lot of my new work is to get rid of this word altogether because I think it's ridiculous. It means the transfer of power. And this is what NGOs are doing all over the world. They're offering empowerment to all these women, which first assumes there was no power. And second, that they have no politics, right? And having been in the NGO world for 10 years, we would go to these meetings at the State Department and they would say, okay, what's very interesting, but we're looking for a clean intervention. We don't want to get into messy politics of stuff. And here I think Arundhati Roy was really, really on point in this essay she wrote for a Maoist magazine. She said there has been this NGOization of resistance, where we've taken women's politics and we've co-opted them in this ridiculous empowerment framework, and that we've tried to blunt the edges of political resistance by offering them this vague sort of notion of empowerment. And when the NGO community recognizes them as political actors, I just finished a long project in Afghanistan, it's through the quota system, right? That you have this many female parliamentarians, this many, like Afghanistan, like Mexico City, like everywhere else. And what that actually means is that you have these women in institutions that are fundamentally flawed, corrupt, patriarchal, any number of other things where the men can't get anything done. This is not a space to realize women's politics, right? All the women campaigning right now for the 50% candidates in Mexico City are given the worst districts, are not giving any money to campaign, are being sexually harassed on their way to the campaign trail. This entrance into formal politics, that can't be our way of solving this. So I'll just end with sort of thoughts on repression and radicalized resistance. I fundamentally believe you cannot understand radicalization without understanding repression in all of its forms. whether it is cultural, whether it is imperial, whether it is state repression. There was this mother who I met in Mexico City or the movement around her, her lawyers, but she was shot while asking the president in the middle of the day in front of the government building about her daughter who was killed in one of these sort of femicides that happened. In Sri Lanka a few months ago, you had a woman who was jailed for asking where her daughter was, jailed for 5 months in a high-security prison. And the mother fighting in Mexico, who's still alive, who's fighting for her son-in-law to be brought to justice for killing her daughter, she looked at me and she said, you know, I don't want empowerment. We need something radical. That's what she said. She said, we need something radical. And everyone in Mexico used this word feminicide. You know, the Western word, it was created by a Western woman, is femicide. And the Spanish word is feminicidio. And I thought it was really interesting that they kept saying feminicide, feminicide, because it was almost like they needed to take it back. It couldn't be Western feminism anymore. It had to be them that were articulating this, and it was this new word, you know, feminicide. And they thought they were saying femicide, but they were saying feminicide over and over. And maybe that's sort of what we need. Maybe that's what we're doing here. You know, we need a new language. We need a language from people who are intimately familiar with how culture wraps around context, who understand these sort of intersecting layers of repression, who are painfully familiar with the risks of resistance, from the woman in Pakistan who was shot last week to any woman who stands up in any of these contexts, from a new subset, which I think some of them are at City College, of scholar activists, of critical humanitarians, of inside outsiders, you know, like myself. So I think we talk often of uplifting the voices of women. It's one of the things I hear all the time in the NGO world. The real problem is that we don't hear the conversation that they're having. We're taking their voices and we're putting them into our conversations. And if you want to understand the female fighter, then you have to hear their conversation, even if you don't like what you hear.
Thanks, NIMMI. Next up, we have Suchitra, and she's going to be discussing when we do identify them, there's a further problem, which is, let me start over. Sorry about that. The problems we have in identifying them actually illuminate greater problems we have that relate more to theories of violence and war, and that's what Suchitra's talk is going to be about. Thank you.
I'm going to start off by saying thanks to NIMMI for organizing this, and I'm really happy to be here and share the stage with remarkable women who've all accomplished impressive things in a very, very short period of time. I'm going to start with a small anecdote because I always do. I started debating when I was about 13 years old. And since then, in all these years, I've been a lawyer, I've been to debates, I've been to moot courts, I've sat in many of these panels. And this is the only time in which I've been on a panel where all the women, starting from the moderator to the speaker, have all been women. And while this might sound shocking to many of us, it isn't. Even before we go away and talk about women in these far distant lands that we have no idea about, I think one has to look around and see within our own houses, our own lives, where we are and where it begins. And that's why I started, and I wanted to start with this quote. No one ever asks a man what a man's role in a revolution is. And that is not just about revolution, it's about everything that we do in our lives. And it comes from this very little research and written about in mainstream, especially about the Black Panthers. And I couldn't start this without this exceptional image that I found recently. And these images are not just important to us today. I mean, these images are important to us today because of what's happening in Baltimore. We are talking about a group of people trying and voicing their opinions, fighting for resistance. And when they do it, women are an important part of it. And these are people who are discarding the ideas of nonviolence and instead going out rioting. They're trying to say that violence perhaps is also a means of political resistance. And these are important to have. I'm going to go and show a couple of images and set up the stage before I go and say other things. I do not know how many of you recognize this image. How many of you have been to Palestine? When you get to Palestine, one of the first things you'll see is a graffiti of this beautiful woman, Laila Khalid, and right next to her you would find the word, "I'm not a terrorist." So Laila Khalid, this is an image taken by a famous American photographer, Eddie Adams. She's a part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and she was part of the group that hijacked one of the flights flying from Rome onwards. And after this image came out, she pretty much became the symbol of resistance. A woman, a beautiful young Palestinian woman with a weapon in hand. These are images of women who are a part of the suffragette movement. These are surveillance images of what the British police did, and they photographed these women. They photographed these women because these were women who believed that sometimes you could use violence to reach an end. In this case, the end was right to vote, right to own property as your brother, right to walk on the street and not be escorted by someone else. This is an image of a violence or a bombing committed by the women of this movement. A bunch of the police officers here are instructing a place, and apparently the suffragette movement, the women of at least a militant wing of the suffragette movement, is supposed to have inflicted this atrocity or damage or success or victory or however you call it, depending on who's narrating the story. This is an image of women of the KKK. This was taken not very long ago, only 45 years ago this image was taken. And it was not just the men who are going out there and trying to implicate and inflict things, but these were women who are very much a part of the propaganda, the ideology, and how these things are done. This is a very gruesome image. And if you look at the right-hand side corner, what you would find is this young married couple. Every time you look at the history of lynching in the United States, and we talk about this is an iconic woman, the iconic image. And many people talk about this image not just because of the gruesome spectacle of what's happened to someone, but also of this image of these two young couple sitting there, in some ways partaking in this terrible spectacle of what's happening to another human being. And the woman's face, if you actually look deep into it, has this look that is almost, you cannot describe it. I could never describe it in any of the essays that I've ever written about this image. Finally, images of women who are a part of the United States Army, and these are images from Abu Ghraib. Women in the military who apparently don't do combat roles, but yet women who have inflicted a certain kind of violence. All these images exist, and yet these stories never get spoken about in one single context. But what connects these images? What connects these images is that these are women. Women in these subversive roles, subversive as society thinks it's subversive. These are women trying to do something, and these are women and their role in society and violence and structural violence that comes with it. So how do we think and talk and think through these ideas of women, violence, and resistance? And as NIMMI was talking before, why is it so difficult for us to understand very simple, basic questions? Today, when we talk about ISIS, what are the things do we want to know? Who are these women? Why are they fighting? What would possibly force these women to do these things? And yet, when we try to answer these questions, we are unable to come to a right answer. And why is it that we are not able to come to a right answer? It begins with the simple idea that we always look at women as somebody who's a victim of violence, never as people who actually physically perpetrate violence. And that kind of takes away the equation, especially when you talk about women in these so-called repressed societies, societies in the Middle East, societies in South Asia. And then when you put these two contexts together, it becomes even harder to think through why is it that we are unable to make a connection between who these women are and why is it that they want to do these things that they're doing. Second, the debates that you have in the United States are debates about can women still join the military in combat roles. The point is that those questions are completely irrelevant because the front line is no longer where we think the front line is. This image happens not in a front line. This image happens in a very secluded place, in a prison, within the structural hierarchy of the US political and the legal system, not outside it, within it. And this is how we need to look and think through issues. And today we can no longer sit and make a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Women, I talk about that, women can no longer be distinguished between combatants and non-combatants because that distinction no longer exists. And we can no longer have that conversation in a world in which the front line is almost always disappearing and disappeared in certain places. So why is it that we're having such a terrible time is that it comes back to ideas of theorizing war. How do we theorize war today? Today, war is theorized within the limitations of agency. And when we talk about agency, there are two things, as NIMMI pointed out, is that one, we talk about emancipation, and one is empowerment. It's very easy to theorize a beautiful young Palestinian woman with a gun. And it's also very easy to talk about women in Yugoslavia who have been raped as a part of the war. What is incredibly hard to theorize are women who have been victims and perpetrators and both. In Liberia, there have been instances in which women who are a part of the combat in the Liberian Civil War have been convicted and charged of perpetrating sexual violence against men and women. So let me repeat it. These are women who have been charged and convicted of perpetrating sexual violence against women and men. The tribunal in Rwanda where I worked for was one of the first international tribunals to convict a woman of an actual crime of genocide. Why is this yet a problem that we have about theorizing war and how we look at women and women in these positions? One of the stories from Rwanda that I would like to share today is that there's a woman, a Tutsi woman, who was killed. Her entire family was murdered and thrown into a well. That's pretty much what happened in all of Rwanda. She survives. As a part of survival mechanism, she actually starts living with a Hutu commander in her area. The Hutu commander falls in love with her, and in some ways, she uses him as a way of looking for other family members. She then starts wearing fatigues. She in some ways assists him and also uses his own political agency to find the remaining of her family. Years later, when Rwanda is kind of coming back to a semblance of normalcy, she is caught and then charged with perpetrating war crimes. And the problem with this narrative is that where would you put this woman? Here was a woman who's lost everything in her life. And yet, she uses whatever that is left to her, in some ways, hijacks the political agency of another man, and yet goes and searches her own relatives, rescues them, at the same time perpetrating violence in her own combats and fatigues. So where exactly do we put these women? And this is not an exceptional case. This is what happens almost every single place. Now, the interesting question is that, so where does all of this take us? What it really takes us to is this place where you can no longer talk about women and violence without thinking about gender, collective identity, and how these women place themselves and narrate themselves. And that's why South Asia becomes a really fascinating place. It's a place where new theories can emerge, and we can talk about them in an interesting way that is just not about the immediate things of agency that again looks at only empowerment and emancipation. For instance, if you look at India, in India, women have been in combat roles since 1940 as a part of INA. These were women who were a part of the more militant wing that was looking for and fighting for independence. Beyond that, India has also had women who were fighting its own separatist wars in Punjab, in Kashmir, in Assam. Places where they've taken up arms, places where they've actually helped not only in operational ways, but they're also ideological heads of places. But increasingly, women have also been a part of RSS, which is India's fundamental Hindu organization, and they have also been a part of the 1984 riot, the 1992-1993 Bombay riots. They were a part of the recent 2004 Gujarat riots, the Godhra riots, but they've also been victims. If you look at the partition narrative in India, there's a very fascinating story that comes out of it. Especially if you go to villages in Punjab, there are certain women who are called martyrs. They're called martyrs simply because the families killed these women before they could be raped during the partition. Their pride comes from the fact that they killed themselves or they were killed instead of being defiled by somebody else. And this is not, and these women are commemorated and thought about, and in some ways they're also local deities. And this is how the woman's body is being transformed, not just as someone who's as a site of communal violence, communal identity, And these are a lot more complicated to think through and theorize than the far distant ISIS that we have to fight about. How do we look at our own sense of resistance and agency in the streets of New York, or in Baltimore, or in the streets where increasingly communal and ethnic violence has become something that's an everyday issue? And one of the things that we need to look at is that, yes, women can be victims, women can be perpetrators, they can hold a gun. Women actually are better shooters than men because for some reason they have smaller shoulders, apparently that helps. But beyond that, these are only two of the main narratives. There are more narratives that we need to think about. And narratives, and I say not just in terms of journalistic dispatches, is that we need to move towards a space where we're not just thinking about theory in isolation. We are not writing terrible stories for Newsweek or New York Times, which has no sense of history or politics, but something that takes into account a very simple fact that history and memory are local. And sometimes, to retrieve those things, we need to do more than just listen to a story. We need to listen to a story, we need to think about the story, and above all, we need to give the people the agency that we've always seemed to take away, which Spivak many years ago said, can the subaltern speak? The question is not whether the subaltern can speak, the question is whether we will allow the subaltern to speak anymore. Again, thank you so much, and I will open the...
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you NIMMI and Suchitra and ZANIB. It's been a very engaging set of presentations so far. It's very enriching for me to be in dialogue with Suchitra and NIMMI, because when most of the work that I've done on Muslim feminism, on the emergence of jihadi feminism, has been done kind of in isolation. There is, a lot of skepticism in terms of, conceptualizing women who join militant groups like ISIL, or the particular madrasa that I'm going to talk about, as a sort of empowerment. In writing about this, I've faced a lot of pushback from editors who don't want to conceptualize it in that way. But I think one of the crucial things to remember when we're talking about this, and you're gonna see this literally every day in the newspaper in terms of girls going to join ISIL, on the prevalence of women in jihadi networks, is that their acts exist and occur very much in dialogue with this, very much in dialogue with American feminism and post-feminism. If you listen to the way they conceptualize what they think women's roles are, it's not so much of a question, I think, of, for instance, what is Islamic or what's not Islamic. It's a question far more of constructing an authentic idea of women's empowerment in the shadow of American intervention. I cannot emphasize that enough. In Pakistan, when obviously in South Asia, when the British were there, was a physical sort of colonial presence, right? Because they were there on the ground for 200 years. Over 200 years. The American presence, of course, is very different. It's, we've had drone attacks now for years and years, and we've had other sort of secret operations, renditions, things like that in Pakistan. So it's a different kind of omniscient presence, right? Because it's a remote control view of this country that is available to the colonial power that is looking at it. And the other sort of omniscient power is through ideas. And sadly, one of those ideas has been this idea of empowerment and education. On one side, the US has droned northwest Pakistan, causing literally hundreds of thousands of people to be displaced. On the other end, you have millions of dollars being pushed particularly into programs that are supposed to serve women. So you've got kind of this colonial intervention very much into the intimate lives of people, right? Because it's this idea of changing the power, but it's connected to a war agenda. And the consequence of that, and I'll give you one figure. UNESCO put out their Education for All report last week that looks at the progress of countries towards the Millennium Development Goals, education goals from 2001 until 2014. In Pakistan, the support for girls' education has fallen from 71%, 71% in 2001 to only 47% today. So this is a number that you have to keep in background of this, because there's a lot of talk about, empowerment and education. But the fact is that when you attach it to a war agenda, that idea becomes delegitimized, becomes tainted. And then there is a consequent search for a different kind of a way to be that throws that off. And you see that very much in women's lives, because they want to be empowered. There are local customs and things in their culture that they don't like. Pakistan is a rapidly urbanizing society. We're going to move by 2040 into a 60% urban country, which is, in 20 years, we've gone from a rural to an urban country. So, you have that breakdown of tribal and other caste community structures that used to exist and in some ways protect women. So with everyone moving into the cities, there is a search for, what are we going to do? What are women's lives going to look like? What is their participation going to be in the public space? And in a sense, that has also created a move to look at law differently, because now that customary law is not as easily available in the village panchayat, or the tribal councils are no longer accessible. You live in a big city. These cases are coming forward. So the story I have for you today is, it's a very particular story of a very particular case. And I think in the details of that story, you can see the complexity of this issue and some of the very complex questions that are being asked. Now, within Muslim feminism, there has been this debate, and this is kind of the context for this, is whether women's roles have to be constructed side by side in juxtaposition with men, so, equality, for instance, or whether they have to be constructed separate from men. So having separate communities, separate leadership structures, so a complementarity versus an equality concept. There's great arguments within that Muslim feminists who are doing the work of reinterpreting Islam and doctrine are doing in this area. But the weight of this has obviously created a greater popularity for ideas of separate, and complementary rather than, juxtaposed next to each other. So within ISIL, for example, their Al-Khansa Brigade, which is their women's brigade, I wrote recently for Al Jazeera about their women's manifesto that they put out. And it's really interesting, right? Because some of the biggest principles that they throw out right at the beginning is one, the Muslim world is in disarray because of the weakness of men. So there's all this stuff about how men are emasculated, and so women have to now do this, which is very, very interesting because, you won't see that in traditional Islamic, even in traditional Islamic jurisprudence. And the other idea is that because we are in a state of war, women are basically allowed to do anything. So they can be in the battlefield, they can fight, they can do anything. So that is a theoretical aspect of it. The story that I have shows how this plays out. Now, it focuses on a madrasa that is, and for those of you who are Pakistani, you'll know this, is a madrasa called Jamia Hafsa, which is in Islamabad. It's in the capital of Pakistan. And it has a tense history. In 2007, again, women from this madrasa went out and kidnapped a woman who they said was a brothel owner. And they brought her back into the madrasa, and they were holding her hostage. And the reason they were holding her hostage is that, they believed that this was disempowering to women, the work that she was doing, and they wanted her to renounce that, and so they were keeping her there. The politics surrounding that ended up with a Pakistani military holding a siege into this madrasa, and so this was the Jamia Hafsa is the women's madrasa. The Lal Masjid, or the Red Mosque, is the men's portion of it. And it ended up essentially, the siege that the Pakistani military did killed, I think it's about 80 people on both sides, so it was a very bloody thing. But this madrasa has been allowed to exist. It continues to be there, and it continues to recruit. So this story begins in December. On December 16th in Pakistan, there was a horrific attack on Army Public School in Peshawar, in which hundreds of children were killed. It was the Taliban came into the school. This was a school for children of army officers, and there was just the most despicable kind of carnage that you can imagine. Now, a few days after the attack on the school, a couple of days, the guy who's the leader of this Red Mosque came on Pakistani TV, and he basically refused to condemn this attack. This was a very, very emotional time in Pakistan, heartrending beyond anything, because there's just these coffins of little children, little kids being carried out of this school. And so this Maulana Abdulaziz's refusal to do this became a national controversy. Two of my friends who are lawyers decided to participate in this protest outside the Red Mosque. So, in Pakistan, NIMMI was talking about NGOization, the protest against these militant organizations, I can't tell you what a courageous thing it is, okay? Because they have a lot of power, and they don't have a lot of people, even within the Pakistani law enforcement, that are willing to take them on or stop them. So even when they were trying to do this protest, there was the police was telling them, please don't do this. Another militant group said they're going to have a counter protest. Anyway, all of this is going on. These two friends of mine who are lawyers go to this protest because they were this is the least we can do. These people in the Red Mosque, they're just an example of how the country is not cracking down on these extremists, allowing them to exist, not exposing them. They're at this protest, and one of these, a man comes up to them, and he tells them, I need your help. He's got a long beard, and he's like, I need your help. My daughter, they're holding my daughter. They've kidnapped my daughter, and they're holding my daughter inside Jamia Hafsa, inside this women's madrasa. My friends are called Heather and Wes. They said, okay, you can also have the megaphone. Everyone is allowed to speak. So when this guy told his story, he was basically saying that in June the year before, so we're in December, the June of the year before, his daughter, who's 26 years old, and I emphasize the age of Uzma Qayyum because 26 years old means that she spent most of her adult life with Pakistan being at war. Okay, and this is an important indicator of this generation that is now in Pakistan. She comes from a middle class, lower middle class, very religious family. And he said, for years she's been a student at this madrasa, not Jamia Hafsa, this one that's just in their neighborhood. She goes every day, and she told us that she wanted to learn more about Islam. We said, that's great. Two of my sons are Hafiz, which means they know the Quran by heart. So it's a very devout family, and they were like, this is great. So she goes to the madrasa, no problems, for a couple of years. There are already people who do, cover and wear burqa, so not a big challenge for them. And then in June, one day, he says she went to the madrasa as she always does, and then it was evening, and she didn't come back. She didn't come back, and so obviously the family is very, very worried and very frantic. They go to see her room. They see that she's laid out a burial shroud on her bed, and kind of saying that I'm leaving. Then that night they get a call from Jamia Hafsa, and the principal of Jamia Hafsa is Hassan, a woman. She's the wife actually of the guy who runs Red Mosque. So it's she runs the women's section of this madrasa, and she says, "Don't worry about your daughter. She's come to us. She's decided to devote her life to Islam, and we've got her. So just don't worry about her." And that's it. That's the phone call. They don't let them talk to Uzma or anything like that. Now, another thing to remember is Jamia Hafsa, a few months before this case was filed, Jamia Hafsa has declared its allegiance to ISIS. Okay, they've put out a video with all the women saying that they would like ISIL to come and liberate Pakistan from its corrupt government. So they get this phone call. The next day, the father says, "We're absolutely frantic. We go to Dal Masjid to see if we can see her, and they say, we're not going to let you see her. You can't see your daughter. She doesn't want to talk to you. Go away." So this is the story they hear at this anti-terrorism protest in Islamabad. And this guy says, "Help me, you're lawyers. I don't have any money. I don't have a lot of resources. I need to get my daughter out of there." So they say, of course, look, this is exactly what's happening in our society. They're brainwashing these girls and taking them inside the madrasa and keeping them there. So they say, but at the same time, he says, we were a little worried because this guy was very, very, very religious. And we were thinking, maybe this is someone that the Red Mosque people have sent to be a plant who's going to try to see what we're up to, whatever. So the next day, so they say, we'll have another meeting, and they decide to have it in the compound of the Supreme Court of Pakistan, which is also in Islamabad, because they figure there'll be a lot of security there, Anyway, when they met there, they find out that he is a legitimate. He has this legitimately has this issue. He brought them pictures of because when they'd gone to try to they tried to forcibly get in because they wanted to see this girl. And the Red Mosque guards beat them up. One time I think they had finally been able to see her, but she was fully veiled, and there were 3 or 4 other women present, and they weren't allowed to talk to her by themselves. So my friends, fresh-faced lawyers that they are, filed a petition on behalf of the father, saying that against Jamia Hafsa, saying that you have to produce this girl in court because this is an issue where she's being kept against her will. There's been no contact. We don't know what sort of situation she's in. And the case ends up in an Islamabad courtroom. At the initial hearing, the judge says, okay, it's because it was referred from the Supreme Court. He's actually really being expediting everything, which is not how usually goes in Pakistani courtrooms. But so he says to the police chief of that area, you have to go and you have to get this girl, and she has to be produced in court. So all of this culminates in this hearing that they have, where Uzma Qayyum finally shows up, and Hassan, who's the head of the madrasa, shows up with her. And some of the things that happen in this hearing show you how difficult this question is. Now, in preparing for this hearing, Heather and Uwais had looked at Pakistani law, and I've written about this before too. Under Pakistani law, one of the most problematic things in Pakistani law has been that if a woman is unmarried, she's legally her father is her legal guardian, and she cannot leave or even really marry of her own choice without permission of her father. So the cases in this area of law have actually all been in cases in which the woman wants to marry someone of her own choice. Sometimes that marriage even happens, and she'll come, and the father is trying to recover her from whoever has married her. And in nearly all of the cases, Pakistan has decided in favor of the father. So the father's right for wilaya or guardianship is considered paramount in that situation, even if sometimes there's evidence that there was a marriage that has taken place. And they won't talk to, they mostly do not listen to the women themselves in that situation. So this is the precedent that they were going to use, and they were uncomfortable with it, but they were certain that Uzma was being brainwashed and kept against her will. So this hearing happens. Hassan gets on the stand, and she talks about Red Mosque, and she's basically saying that, look, we are not keeping her against her will. My father has been trying to marry me off to this cousin for several years. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in devoting my life to a bigger cause, and that's what I've done. I don't want to leave. I want to stay at this madrasa, and I don't understand why you are doing this, essentially. So the point being, at the culmination of the case, you have people who are totally against, discrimination against women, arguing for the right of a father to compel a girl to leave this madrasa and come home. And you have the madrasa that is arguing to change the law so that women, these girls, have the right to choose to stay within the madrasa if it so happens. And that is, in a nutshell, the complexity of the question in Pakistan. If a girl runs away from her family in Pakistan, her reputation is destroyed forever, unless she runs away in the cause of God to a madrasa. So you have a situation now where you have this vastly, rapidly urbanizing country, a population that is 60% under 25, okay? And no other social system that's going to absorb the casualties of that change. And what these madrasas are doing, and they have a militant agenda. There is no doubt that they are completely, proponents of violence in every way. They will not deny it. But they're absorbing these women that the rest of the society has no idea what to do with. And unlike the NGOs, and it was interesting, right? Because in this case, so then, my friends had an existential crisis after this hearing because they're like, we don't want to send her back to her father's place if he doesn't want to do this. So then, they tried to find shelters and interim places where she could go. And the problem with those is that they don't have the kind of protection to keep her family away. They don't have the kind, in a country where security is such a problem, they don't have the armed guards, they don't have all of that that's going to be able to say, no, you cannot come in. This is a women's shelter. There's absolutely no way you can be here. Because the social, cultural fabric will always defer to the family in the case of a woman who's run away. So the case ends. Right now, this is, and this story is going to be published in The Nation. So, a longer piece if you want to look at that. The last I spoke to Sheikh Qayyum, the father, Uzma was sent back. The judge sent an order, and the order that you read, it's really kind of heartbreaking because she says, this was kind of the agreement that the judge said, this is, what are your demands? We'll issue an order to your families that they'll listen to these demands. And her demands are, I should be allowed to continue my education in Islam if I want. I should not be married without my choice. That the home environment, should be more Islamic, which means, and she specifically says apparently because, the man that her father wanted to marry her to is a cousin. And this is one of the contradictions, right, in Pakistani culture, is that even though it's very religious, family members are in and out. And so if you're trying to refuse marriage to someone who is your cousin, that person's family members are constantly in your house. And it's very difficult to do that if you are like one girl standing out. So these are ways in which these madrasas are completely upending social and cultural norms in Pakistan. Their politics and their agenda is accessible to women in a way that NGOs, that whole realm is not. I'll say that because I grew up in a conservative Muslim family. And, my father would say, you can go to any all-women things, which means that it would be like religious classes or classes that are held under auspices of quasi-religious groups. He would not let me go participate in a march or a protest. And that's the reality of millions of Pakistani women. But because these are sort of women-only groups, women have more, have accessibility to them. They're able to, and there's different levels of what they supply to women, right? So, not everybody is going to join Jamia Hafsa and take up a gun, but it is a way of saying that, I'm going to learn about the Quran, so you can't stop me, dad, or you can't stop me, husband, or you can't stop me, brother or son. And that is a very, very popular phenomenon in Pakistan, urban and rural, revivalist movements that have spent a lot of time doing the groundwork and developing the grassroots support among ordinary women who are actually not very politically inclined. But, it started out as spiritual empowerment, and now it's obviously revealing a very political agenda. And the question is where that's going to go. And I don't have an answer because it probably would not have been in this place if there hadn't been a war in Afghanistan, if there hadn't been drones in the northwest frontier, or Khyber, sorry. But the fact is that there have been. And so when you stand up to talk about empowerment in Pakistan, it's a very class-based argument. Because if you're very wealthy or you're upper middle class educated in English, you're going to say, yes, the NGOs, empowerment, you can participate in what I call essentially the aid culture that the United States has created, right? You've pumped in millions of dollars and it enfranchises a particular class of people who can then work for these NGOs and write the reports and do all of that. And it's difficult, quite honestly, for me to even talk about that because those are all my friends. Those are all people I know, and they are the most well-meaning people. But the fact is that there is a tremendous class difference between that and families like Uzma Qayyum, who are educated families, but educated in Urdu, more religious, concerned about their daughters' reputations and who they're going to associate with. They don't have access to that world of aid economy. And they're the ones who are by droves now signing up onto a different idea of empowerment. And because it's this idea that if you are at war, you are permitted to do anything. So, thank you.
When we try to build a predictive model and figure out what's going to cause someone to do something, we sort of look at a list of factors. And a lot of the factors that I see for these young women that are moving to ISIS and to all of these different organizations or that are becoming radicalized, I see a lot of the same factors. But something stopped me from going in that direction that didn't stop them. And I was wondering if you had any insight about that. What makes someone radicalized and what, that fits the same profile and prevents other people from not going down that same path?
Yeah, I'm probably going to be permanently disbarred from political science for this answer, but I don't actually believe there are patterns and models that you can use as predictive of human behavior. I think if you ask me why the female fighter fights, the first struggle that people have is, well, women join these movements, and the second is, well, okay, why do they join? And they need the one answer, but some of the women I met joined because they fell in love with a boyfriend. Some of them joined because they believed the intellectual cause. Some of them joined because they needed the money. Some were, mentally ill and they needed a place to belong, and some changed their minds along the way. They decided to join, they left, they were more into it before, and they changed. And what happens is when you look at women in the developing world, you don't want to give them these same sort of exceptions and idiosyncrasies that we give ourselves, right? We need them to be one thing or the other, poor or something. For me, that's where I find the thread being sort of state repression. Now, the context of state repression will always intersect with personality, right? Personality becomes a big driver in terms of who joins and who doesn't join. When I was much younger, when I went back to Sri Lanka, I thought, well, if I lived here, I would join the Tigers. And I think the part that we're missing with the whole Coldplay, Harry Potter, that whole aspect, is that we're not able to understand the role of identity, right? And that even if she wasn't sort of militantly in support of an extreme version of some religion or another, is that she was around conversations the same way I was. She was listening to the legacies of violence. She was exposed to the idea that she was somehow different than these countries that she lived in, whether or not she read Harry Potter and Coldplay. And one of the things I love about City College is the diversity of the young women there who are all struggling with this sort of tension, whether they're secular or religious, or they should be traditional or modern, or social media versus history and context. And one of the things that I've gotten to do in this space in the past 3 years is just embrace all of it, and to say that these tensions are providing insight and providing value, and that there is an identity there that we're missing. But yeah, I think that the pattern of human behavior is a problematic approach.
Great answer. Let's go ahead and let's take one from the audience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask?
The question I asked is one about maybe what your visions from your experience and the conversations with the women is about what that future vision of community and also nation or whatever that group could be. Because one of the things I see here is the ways in which they very honestly talk about the state and their own local community as sources of violence, whereas we interject the state as the solution, right? We got to go and fix the state, but they're saying the state doesn't work. So how do you, what are the ways in which they talk about growing and developing a complex of rights that work outside something like the nation state and outside of the ways in which their local communities work and are there right now?
Sure, I think that's a great question. And one of the issues underneath that I've noticed is that there's two kinds, and this is talking particularly about Muslim women, that there are two kinds of global civil society you can tap into now. There's kind of the global empowerment discussions in terms of transnational organizations, things like that, and then there is this. Is Muslim transnational identity is very real, and I think that ISIL, as well as it's one of the commonalities actually that I see within both a girl like Uzma who went or a girl like Aqsa who joins ISIL is this desire to be part of something greater than yourself, and what they perceive as a greater ability to influence what that greater will be. I think that one of the challenges in, post-Afghanistan, Iraq, that a lot of Muslims face is that, men or women, is that global civil society doesn't always reflect their identity. There's no real acknowledgement of the fact that if you're born Muslim today, you're far, far more likely to be born in conflict, displaced, war. But that's not reflected in the politics of the UN, of UNESCO, of other rights groups. And it is. It is the first denominator of groups like these militant groups. They're putting that at the forefront. And so they see that, okay, if you really care about the latest report from Physicians for Social Responsibility, 1.2 million casualties, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan combined in the war on terror. So 1.2 million, they want that to be the forefront of their political identity. The religious part, in a lot of ways, is incidental. But
I guess I would just add to that. Obviously the Tigers had a nation, lost the nation. The part that I would speak to is how the ideology is bred of nationalism, and that it becomes this response to extreme Buddhism or Buddhist nationalism, and so it was the counter-nationalism that emerged, which in my sort of view now, it was that was a failure of imagination, because had there been at that point what looked more like a class struggle across ethnic lines, it's very likely it would have succeeded. And the fear with extreme ideologies like nationalism is that it's very easy to map other things onto them, like militarization, like patriarchy, and then have that sort of trickle down into the lives of men and women in a way that they weren't really able to recognize. All that they saw, these women, was that nationalism was a solution to Buddhist nationalism, not being able to see that it provided this framework for all these other repressive ideologies to take hold in their lives.
And how do we get that in these places where the access to these things are mandated and mediated by other structures? That structure could be a structure that's the state-owned. That could be a structure in certain places which is owned by insurgents. In some places, it could be something as simple as owned by the one patriarch in a family. And in these places, we cannot, again, imprint upon these ideas of rights anywhere, and it never works, and it has never worked at all. And when we look at the idea of ungoverned spaces, what ungoverned spaces do in the study, and there's this fascinating study in which you look at who are the ungoverned spaces. Initially, it was the gypsies, it was the Romas, it was these traveling nomads, the Wild Wild West. And what you really see is this hierarchy in which people are very fluid, and that's true of Afghanistan as well. Each village, even separated a mile away, one would have a kinship in which it's hierarchical. And a couple of months down the line will become egalitarian. And a few years down the lane, the Khan, who was the single most important person, would be replaced by the madrasa. And this does not mean that somehow the power has been lost. It simply means that people mediate their life through a hierarchy of needs. And as NIMMI rightly pointed out initially, is that we cannot theorize human nature, and that's why we're all in business. Because otherwise, then none of us would actually have jobs, simply because human nature is that volatile. And whether you believe, as Hobbes feel, it's short, nasty and brutish, or do you believe that it is not so bad, is where we live, and a big part of what we do is not so much as to theorize the world as we want it reflected, but try and understand theory as a way of perhaps understanding the small things that can be mediated, that is actually possible, that if you look at someone, perhaps it helps you have a better conversation, which means that the other person will perhaps not go blow up a cafe. Those are the very small things that you could possibly do. And political science and everything else has actually failed in understanding that. The only group of people that actually give credit to understanding it are anthropologists, who also seem to understand a little bit of philosophy. And I'm kind of saying that because all three of us do that. So I'm being quite selfish. So I'll leave it at that.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, I'm a new professor in the Colin Powell School. I'm a sociologist by training, but also I do ethnography, which is I follow people, mostly women in New York City. And I'm very interested there is a book that I use in one of my class on the daughters of immigrant, which is by Egyptian American anthropologist, Laila Abdullahu. And she writes about, how the West and Western societies are now interested in saving Muslim women in the Middle East, and whether or not Muslim women are really in need of saving. And I don't mean saving religiously, but saving in terms of political ideology. And from what I hear tonight, I'm really delighted to hear all the empowerment and all the ways in which women join radicalism, right? And I'm really interested in knowing under what circumstances will women in the Middle East or in Islam create their own ideology to integrate in the society, not just for radical sisters who join Islam to do bombing or join the war, but how do you think, after all that you know and all that you expose, how do you think women in Islam, or for that matter in New York, among immigrant women who are minorities like Latinas, will join a cause that will help them integrate complementarily or along men? Because from what I hear, it looks like men are the one that needs rescue.
I'll start by saying that women are already doing that. Women do it every single day. They do it not just in the confines of New York City, they do it in every other part of the world. I'll give you two examples. Since you brought up Egypt, I spent 2 years in Egypt when I ran an NGO that gave legal aid for Iraqi refugees. These were people from Iraq who had left Iraq, and Egypt was their third country. And the legal aid that I was giving, or my team was giving, was simply to make sure that these people could not go back home, so they had to be resettled to a second or third country. Often when you sit down to prepare refugee legal case files, what you need is a story. Just as Rafia beautifully narrated a story today, I need to narrate a story that would convince the person sitting in front of me in less than 20 minutes why this person whose family has gone through the worst of anything, that includes entire neighborhoods being ethnically cleansed, families in which women being raped, boys being raped, why do they deserve a second chance in a place like the United States? And often when you look at it, it's the women who always come with the documents. They remember everything. They are the ones holding the family together. They are the ones who, if the boys get picked up, they are the ones who need to go to the police station and negotiate in every single time. Again, similarly, in a place like Kashmir, in which now I've started doing extensive field work, it's the women who are on the forefront of resistance. These are the women. I'm not talking about women who go and find out routes for insurgents to cross the border. I'm talking about women who have to get up every day in one of the world's most militarized zones, go and get a bottle of milk. That milk might not be available. So you need to find a way of, one, having money. Also, we're talking about a space in which where a good 75% of the, that's considered exact. Let's say 50% of the young boys between the age of 18 to 45 have disappeared in this last 20 years. So men are disappeared. So often these are women who are head of families. So one, there's no money. Second, if there's money, there's probably no rations. So you need to go get that milk. And by the time you leave your house and you have to go get that milk and come back, you probably cross 2 checkpoints, right? Second, these women also have children, boys who pelt, boys who get picked up by the police, boys. Who do you think goes to the police stations, who goes to these local centers and tries to negotiate, begs and pleads and make sure that the boy comes back home? It's the mothers. In that sense, women are doing it every single day. If you ask a mother who's raised a child in New York City, she will tell you how hard it is. Because I'm now in an age where I finally have friends who are having children, and apparently having a child in New York City and putting it in a good school is an act of resistance. And sometimes you have to deal with those things, right? I mean, women do it every single day, and some of the strongest person I know is my mother. It's the women in my house, which means that women do it every single day. It's not that we do it because we are special. We do it because the world around us is completely shitty, and I do believe that the world is really short, nasty, and brutish. In that sense, yes, and the solidarities that you have today is what you see is that when NIMMI wrote an email, she was very frustrated. It's simply this one act of email that says, let's do something about it, and then reaching out to Rafia or me means that today there is a panel. And that is an act of resistance, and somebody making sure that this space is available and negotiating for that space. I think all of that matters, and women do it all the time, and we do it because there's no other option but to do it. So yeah, that's.
I would just add that, I think that's an excellent book. And if you, in terms of Muslim women, if you leave with one idea, it is that, some of the ways in which Muslim feminism is politically being interpreted right now is because for a long time it has had to be the lesser sister of white feminism. That's just the plain truth. For a long time and now, feminism in the West is defined against the repression or the constructed repression of women in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Egypt, without any effort at all to contextualize those issues. I wrote about the whole, I called it schoolgirl feminism because it's, let's save the schoolgirls, or let's give this, because it's this very, very concerted effort to treat other feminisms as uncomplicated. No one's ever going to have one panel on how you save American women, because everyone understands that their problems are spread across class and race and ethnicity and so many other factors. But they do have those all the time, where Pakistani, Afghani, Muslim women are concerned, because it's this idea that that white feminism is superior, and we have to treat. And that's the legacy in a lot of ways of colonialism. The tragedy, of course, is that when ideas get sort of politically tainted in that way, sometimes you have reactions to them that are not entirely productive. I'm not going to deny that. That, Uzma going away to like Jamia Hafsa, is that going to give her any real empowerment? No. She's going to be in this madrasa with other women. She'll, have a marriage in which she probably will have as little say, but it will be to someone who's as religiously devout as her. But it's an alternative in a situation where there aren't always a lot of alternatives. But that paradigm of saving Muslim women is the dominant paradigm. You can't read one New York Times newspaper without encountering it. So, if you take anything from here, you should take some skepticism to those depictions and to those ideas, and how they portray things in a certain way, so that in a way that silences women here, right? Because oh, you've got it great, because this isn't happening to you. So
I think the only thing I would add is that is part of the political project for the next generation. I think this idea of engendering justice, whether it's racial, religious, ethnic justice, is a very complicated one, and one that I think most of us didn't start out with, because at that stage your choice was to be a nationalist or a feminist. You couldn't necessarily challenge the patriarchal structures within what you were doing because it was too important to the Tamil cause, right? Which meant that in a meeting where, a bunch of Tamil politicians were very sexist and very rude to me, we still had to finish the conversation about how to get the, supplies to a certain area where 1,000 people were dying a day, right? And that's a choice that young women today, I hope, won't have to make. They'll start to insist that from the very beginning of any conversation of justice, it is engendered that you can ask both those questions at the same time. And similarly, amongst the young men who we are now terrified of, this UN Vice Chair of Millennium Development Goals the other day came and she was like, well, you have to look at these numbers, there are so many young men being born around the world, and it's just terrifying. And I just thought, what happened that we're afraid of young men being born? How ridiculous is it that you're already putting this assumption of radicalization on them? So it is something about this sort of process of dismantling patriarchy and the opportunity that this next generation has to do that, and one that I now sort of come to a bit late. but I still find it very difficult because, you know, you're with all these men activists and you're getting nowhere because, so you figure you may as well go with the point that you can make because you're getting nowhere, you know? And so I think that keeping those two equal, I hope, is something that we'll start to see in the next generation.
I actually would just like to remind you of one thing, which is that when you read about Muslim women all over the world, you probably don't think of me. You probably don't think of someone well-educated who had pretty much all of the advantages that a person could ask for. I had great parents. I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people like me. And when we talk about feminism in the United States, I know a lot more people with a similar background to me, and I don't think that's just a consequence of being insulated in my own bubble world. I think that it's actually probably largely because of the brain drain of the Pakistani community. So when you see other Pakistani, you know, Muslim Americans, they tend to come from pretty well-to-do backgrounds. But I consider myself to be a fairly devout Muslim, and I dress like this, you know, pretty much all the time. So you can't really tell how someone feels about their God in their heart and how that dictates the way that they engage with the world. I also don't believe in theocracy of any form. So that makes me dramatically different from a lot of the young women that you see that are becoming radicalized in other ways. But at the same time, I've made the same argument to my parents that Usma, is that what her name was? Mm-hmm. That Usma made, that in Islam, my parents don't have the right to tell me who I can and cannot marry. And, you know, up until the point, even when I got married, excuse me, we were trying to find an imam to, excuse me. I was really obsessed, very adamant about finding an imam that didn't require my father's consent in order to marry us. And it was symbolically very important to me because in Islam, my father's consent is not required. And it was a big deal to me. It caused a huge fight in my family. But ultimately, you know, my power as a Muslim woman is not given to me by my father or by my husband, and that's never been the case, and it never will be the case.
That's excellent.
I don't know that I've ever attended a panel where a dominant narrative has been so deftly and persistently turned on its head. So thank you all for the vision and the insight and the ideas that I'm sure we'll be carrying around and mulling over for weeks and months to come. I want to thank all of our panelists, Rafia, Suchitra, NIMMI, ZANIB. Really terrific. I want to thank the fabulous people at the Colin Powell School that worked to put this together, Inkem, Didi. Charlene is gone, Joanna is gone. And finally, thank all of you for coming out tonight and joining us in this conversation. It was terrific to have you. It was a wonderful dialogue. Thank you. Good night.